tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can sand and polish resin to get that glass-like shine, and all of my tips and tricks that I've learned along the way to make it so much more easier. Now you're going to need a power tool to help you with this. You can buy polishing machines, or you can use an orbital sander, a Dremel, or even an electric drill. You can see on my Dremel and my drill I have these attachments that I've added on to the end, and these allow me to then attach sanding discs and my polishing pads to them, and I'll add a link down below in my description on where you can purchase these. Now you don't need to have all three of these machines, one of them will do. I also have multiple different grits of sandpaper, as well as two different polishing compounds. One has a rougher grit and one is for that final polish, so one kind of buffs and one will give that extra shine. And then I've also got this resin cleaner, as well as a few different types of polishing pads. So I have some loose head polishing pads, sponge polishing pads, as well as these soft hair ones as well, and a 3000 and a 4000 polishing pad. And you can use all of these, or you can only use some of these, and I'll get more into all the different types as the tutorial goes on. I have a microfiber cloth, a toothbrush, and some water to clean the resin in between each sanding and polishing. And it's really important too to also make sure that you've got the right safety gear. So because we will be sanding back some of that resin, you definitely need to wear a respirator, and I also like to wear goggles just to protect my eyes. Now this is the first piece that I'm going to be polishing, and I'm going to be using a 400, a 600, an 800, and a 1200 grit sandpaper to start with. Now, if you do have a lot of damage or the surface is quite rough, you might have to go to a lower grit sandpaper. But for this, because it came out of the mold and it's pretty good, it was just an older silicone mold and it's left some marks on the surface, I'm going to be polishing it and starting at a 400 grit. But with this second item, I'm going to show you how you can do it when you do have some visible damage. So you can see around this edge of my second resin item, I've actually got some resin that's spilt on it. So I'm going to show you how you can sand and polish it to fix that issue. Something that's really important to be mindful of when you are starting is to make sure that your sanding discs are directly over your sanding pad and they're not slightly off center. Your sanding pad does have little spikes that stick out that help attach the sanding disc to them. So if it's not completely over the entirety of that sanding pad, you will end up with that scratching your piece. When you do a really rough sand like a 200 or a 300, you don't really see those scratches, but when you are getting into really fine grit sanding, they will become really obvious in the piece. So you need to make sure that that sanding disc is always directly over the top of the sanding pad. And it's also really important to make sure you get the right size sanding pads for whether you're using an orbital sander, a polishing machine, or a Dremel attachment, or your drill. So with this Dremel attachment that I bought online, it came with these sanding discs that were the correct size. But if you do run out, you can always buy bigger sanding discs and cut them down to be the smaller sizes. So I'm starting off here with a 400 grit, and I'm going to be doing about 5 to 6 passes. And between each pass, I'm going to be cleaning back my piece. And I just use some water and a microfiber cloth to remove all of that excess sand dust. And the reason why you do passes instead of keep sanding for a prolonged period of time, it's because of a few reasons. The first reason is that the resin will start to get really hot if you're using a power tool on it for too long, and there is that possibility of it melting. So by doing passes and taking a break and cleaning in between, it gives that resin a chance to cool down and not to overheat. The other reason is if that sand dust is staying on the piece while you're sanding, especially when you're getting to a finer grit, it can actually start to re-scratch up the piece. So it's really important to do passes and clean in between to remove all of that excess excess dust, and also then gives you a chance to clean your sanding discs so that way that they don't start to clog up. I also find it helps me a lot to get a smoother and cleaner finish, because by removing all of that excess dust, I'm able to see the piece better, and by doing multiple passes, it means I'm not going to miss any areas that I might have if I just continuously sanded the whole way through and didn't clean in between. So even though doing about 5 to 6 passovers on a piece does take quite a lot of time and it can be quite tedious, you'll get a lot better finish. If you do try to skip this and only do like 2 or 3, a lot of the time I do find that I will not have removed all of the scratches from the previous sanding grits and I have to go back anyway. So you might as well do the 5 to 6 passes to begin with, then have to go back because you can still see some sand marks from a previous grit. That is also why we are working our way through grits. So I started off with the 400 grit because that's going to remove those big imperfections. And then I'm working my way to a 600, then to an 800, and then to a 1200. The 1200 will be my final grit, and that will leave me with a really smooth finish. It won't be super shiny, and that's where we'll then switch over to polishing pads, but it won't have any scratch marks or any imperfections in it when I do get my way up to that 1200 grit. Now, because this is a small piece, that is also why I chose to use my Dremel over my orbital sander or my polishing machine. Now, if you want to use an orbital sander, it is really great to use, and the technique is the exact same with the different grits of sandpaper and doing the passing over. But the reason why I didn't choose to use my orbital sander for a piece this size is because it is so small and my orbital sander is quite big and it's also quite strong. So I find it's quite hard to do smaller pieces without accidentally damaging them, because I have to hold my piece while also holding the orbital sander, and because it's only got one speed, it will sometimes the piece I can't hold on to properly and can end up going flying across the room. So I find for safety and also not to damage my piece even more, I only really use my orbital sander if I'm doing larger pieces that are quite heavy and not going to go flying across the room if I'm not able to hold it while I'm also sanding back. And something else that's really important to mention is if you're doing a resin piece, make sure that you have it on a surface where it's not going to get scratched, because you don't want to be polishing one side and then accidentally scratching the other side by having it on a table where there is that excess sanding dust or anything that could accidentally scratch it as you're applying pressure. So that's why I do have that paper towel down, so that way it can rest on the paper towel while I am polishing this side up. And I also make sure that in each time that I do clean my piece, I also then clean the area, so that way I'm removing all of that dust from everywhere. And I'm also wet sanding. So you can see there I've just sprayed some water, and the reason why I do this is, one, it helps keep the resin piece cool, and it just also prevents all of that dust from flying around. So I've gone through all of my sanding grits, so my 400, 600, 800 and 1200, and you can see this is the shine that I've gotten on this surface area that I have sanded up. So it's already got a nice shine without using any polish. But because I want to get that glass-like finish, I'm now going to start using some polishing compound. I've got 2 different polishing compounds that I'm going to be using, and the first one that I'm using has a bit more of a rougher grit to it, and I like to think of this as the buffing stage, where I'm going to be really pushing that compound in and starting to buff it up. And then the final polishing compound that I'm using is really fine grit, and you'll be able to feel the difference when you do touch polishing compounds, and that's going to be that final stage to really make it shine and add that gloss finish. Now I'm using a sponge attachment for this, but you could also use a 300 grit sanding pad or even a 4000 grit sanding pad for this step. The sponge attachments are really great, but they do end up soaking up a decent amount of that polishing compound. So You can go for either or, it's just a personal preference, but I do find the sponge attachments really buff in that compound and start to give it a really beautiful shine to it. I haven't sped this part of the video up because I wanted you to see how long it actually takes to really buff in that compound. The more you buff it in, the better the finish is going to be. So I've left this going for real time. I didn't speed up this section, and I generally do 2 passes over just to make sure that I don't miss any areas. So this is the first pass over, and where I haven't polished it, you can see the difference in the shine with how shiny the front is to the rest, where it's still got that dull sort of matte finish from that mold being older. And now with my second pass over, once again I'm applying more of that polishing compound, and I'll add a link below to where I bought it. It comes with the polishing compound and also the resin cleaner as a set. And this is a really good polishing compound. You can also use Yorkshire Grit. There are a whole bunch of different ones out there on the market. There's marine polishing compounds. You can see in the next one I'm going to be using car polish. There's a whole bunch of different brands that you can use. I just like to use one that's got a bit more of a rougher grit, and then one that's really fine for that final polish, and I find that gives me a really beautiful glass finish every single time. Before I go to my finer grit polishing compound, I'm going to give it a really good clean just to make sure I don't have any of the first compound left on my piece. And for my final polish, I am going to be switching up my polishing pad as well. So this is a microfiber polishing pad, and you can get this in multiple different sizes depending on what sort of drill or attachment you're going to be using. And this one I like to use for the final. You can also get a cloth one that's really good, but it will just help make it extra shiny, and it's really soft, so it works really great with this polishing compound. So this one is actually a car polish, but it is really great to get that glass-like finish. When I do add my polishing compound, I start on a really low setting on my Dremel. One, because I don't want that to go everywhere if I go straight in on a really high setting. But then as it does start to buff into my piece, I constantly increase my setting, because what also really helps get that piece looking really shiny is how fast and the speed of your settings when you are buffing it in. So if you only use a low setting, or if you're trying to do this by hand, you won't be able to buff it in as well as if you have it up on a high setting. So the higher the setting, the more shine, because the more it can really push that compound into your resin piece. So it's really important that you start off on a low setting and then build it up. But you can see I have a really beautiful glass-like finish now on that area of this piece that I've done all of my sanding and polishing. For this piece, I'm starting with a 240 grit because I have more resin to remove. On the first piece, it was pretty good. It just had some markings from the mold being old. So I didn't need to go to a lower grit to start with, because I didn't have as much area that I needed to remove or as much damage. But with this, because it does have that bit of resin sticking out, I'm going to start with a 240 grit just to speed up the process. But if you've got a piece that doesn't necessarily need that lower grit, then you can start higher. So if it's got a pretty good finish, you just want to make it shinier, you can maybe start on an 800 grit and go from there. Or if it needs more work, then you want to go to a lower grit like this piece. So I'm also wet sanding once again. Now, because this piece has a curve to it, using a orbital sander wouldn't be possible, because they only really work with flat sanding. If I tried to use it on this piece, it would be really hard to kind of get it to curve around and not sand off areas that I didn't want it to sand off. So that's why, once again, I'm using my Dremel attachment to do my sanding of this piece, because it lets me just focus on this small detail area and also helps work around that curve, which I wouldn't be able to do if I was using my orbital sander for this. I am going to be switching to a different polishing machine for this piece once I have sanded it back, but all of the steps that I did previously are going to be the same. So I'm starting off with my 240, and then I'm going to go to my 400, then to my 600, then to my 800, and then to my 1200, and I'm going to be doing about 5 to 6 passes for each one, and I'm just going to keep repeating that process. Another little tip that I do like to do is this. You get a texter and go over the area that you're going to be sanding, and it will then be able to show you what areas you've missed, because sometimes when you are sanding back a piece, it can be really hard to see if you have missed any areas until you kind of hold it up to the light. So by putting a texter over the top, it's going to show me areas that I've missed, because the texter marks will still be there. So I could see there that even though I had sanded over that area, I still had bits of that texter marking it, and it showed me that I needed to go back in and do an extra pass with that same grit. So in between each changing of the grits, I will remark my piece with texter, wait for the texter to dry, and then go back in and sand it. And if I can still see the texter markings, it means it needs to keep being sanded back with that same grit until all of those texter markings are gone. So that's a really great way if you do struggle to see if you have removed the previous markings from a rougher grit, is by using a texter to color it in, because then it's really obvious if you haven't done so. So once I have gone up to my 1200 grits, I'm going to start my buffing and polishing. This time I'm going to be using a different tool. So this is actually a bench grinder, which I have taken off the grinding pieces and added 2 polishing pads. So one is a really soft polishing pad, and the other one is a bit more firmer. So I'm going to be working with my firmer polishing pad to begin with, which is the colored one, and I'm going to be using my rougher grit polish, and I'm just going to be going over that and really buffing that in with my firmer polishing pad that's made from cloth. So this is a really great option if you do have a curved piece like this, because it really lets you get into all of the different areas and the curve really easily. And this is quite a strong machine, so it gives you a really good high shine, and I can also control the settings. So I always start off on a lower setting and do my first sort of pass over, and then really turn it up and buff it in. If you are going to be using a bench grinder, just make sure to get it secured to your table. For this one, I did move it so you could see in the camera, but I normally do have it attached to my table, just because it is so strong. It can sometimes end up sliding across from how strong it is. So for this, I'm just kind of holding on to it while I'm also polishing to make sure it's not moving around, but normally it is attached to my table for safety. Now, you don't have to get this tool to be able to polish your resin. You could still keep using the Dremel. I just prefer to use this when I do any sort of curved pieces, because I find it's easier to move the piece around and really get into all of those curves when I am using my bench grinder with my polishing pads over using just my Dremel. But you don't have to get this machine. You can still get a really nice finish even on a curved piece with a Dremel, just the exact same way that I did with my flat piece. I just prefer to use this machine because it's stronger, and I just like the finish that I get. Once I have done my first buff, the exact same thing, I'm switching over to my softer polishing pad and adding my finer polish onto it for that finish. And I always start off low and then slowly increase the speed of my machine, so that way I get a really good finish and polish to it. And so those are the different methods that I use to polish up my resin. If you found this video helpful, please give it a big thumbs up. And if you are new to my channel, please do subscribe, as I've got tons of different resin tutorials available. Just simply check out the resin playlist. But thank you so much for watching.